By the dawn of the 20th century, the entire global population faced an impossible mathematical nightmare. Human expansion was accelerating exponentially, yet the world's agricultural soil was completely depleted of nitrogen. Without a miraculous scientific intervention, billions of people were guaranteed to tragically starve to death. This terrifying bottleneck was known as the Malthusian trap. It dictated that human populations would always multiply faster than their capacity to grow food. For decades, global leaders watched in absolute horror as crop yields plummeted year after year, fully realizing a catastrophic global famine was rapidly approaching. Nature offered exactly one known cure for this agricultural disaster: raw nitrogen. But extracting it was a monumental physical challenge. The atmosphere was choked with limitless nitrogen, but it was held together by an unbreakable triple chemical bond. Plants could not absorb it, humans could not breathe it. The only readily accessible source of usable nitrogen on the entire planet was massive deposits of seabird excrement, known as guano, completely isolated on remote islands off the coast of South America. This single, tiny geographical location overnight became the most brutally contested and valuable real estate on Earth. The relentless global reliance on South American guano created one of the most ruthless monopolies in human history. The British Empire quietly and systematically seized absolute control over these vital shipping lanes, effectively holding the entire world's desperate food supply hostage behind an impenetrable wall of naval warships. By controlling every mile of ocean, connecting the fertilizer mines to the dying farms of Europe, the saltpeter cartels could arbitrarily inflate shipping costs overnight. They silently bankrupted entire nations who dared to resist, forcing governments to pay extortionate, crippling prices simply to keep their helpless citizens alive. As the Guano Islands were rapidly stripped bare and completely exhausted of their resources, absolute panic swept through the scientific community. The British monopoly was tightening its iron grip, and the finite supply was vanishing. The world needed a synthetic solution, or mass extinction was fundamentally guaranteed. The greatest chemists in Europe violently shifted their focus, entering a frantic, high-stakes intellectual arms race. The objective was mathematically simple, but chemically impossible: rip nitrogen directly from the thin air and forcibly synthesize it into solid fertilizer. Whoever solved this would physically control the future of humanity. Laboratory after laboratory declared the task scientifically hopeless. Every attempt to crack the triple bond of atmospheric nitrogen required more energy than it produced, resulting in catastrophic explosions, melted equipment, and completely bankrupted research teams. The atmosphere was a fortress, and it relentlessly refused to surrender its treasure. By 1900, the world's wheat reserves plummeted to critically dangerous levels. The saltpeter monopoly grew incredibly wealthy, while the global poor began to quietly starve in the streets. The terrifying math was undeniable. Humanity had roughly 10 years left before the entire global agricultural system violently collapsed. This was the absolute final hour for civilization. The brutal bottleneck of nitrogen scarcity was actively choking the life out of the planet. Every government, every king, and every starving farmer desperately prayed for a single scientific miracle, and that miracle would emerge from the darkest corners of Germany. Fritz Haber was a relentlessly obsessive German chemist who refused to accept the limitations of nature. While others pursued safer paths, Haber locked himself away, determined to break the invincible triple bond of nitrogen. He approached the problem not with caution, but with sheer, unyielding intellectual violence and intense pressure. In 1909, utilizing an extremely rare osmium catalyst and unprecedented levels of pressurized heat, Haber achieved the scientifically impossible. Inside a tiny, heavily reinforced glass tube, he forced nitrogen and hydrogen to merge. Slowly, miraculously, a single drop of liquid ammonia formed before his very eyes. But there was a devastating, monumental catch. Haber's tabletop experiment produced roughly half a cup of ammonia every few hours. To feed the entire dying planet and break the ruthless British guano monopoly, humanity required thousands of tons every single day. Scaling it up was considered engineering suicide. Enter Haber-Bosch, an exceptionally ruthless and deeply obsessive engineer working for the massive German chemical conglomerate, BASF. While senior executives dismissed Haber's glass tube as a completely useless party trick, Bosch stared at it in profound silence. He saw the precise blueprint for absolute global corporate dominance. Bosch proposed something that sounded like pure madness. He wanted to construct terrifying, massive steel reactors that would violently compress explosive hydrogen gas to 200 atmospheres of pressure, while heating it to a blistering 600 degrees Celsius. Nothing on Earth had ever been built like this. The entire international engineering community fiercely mocked him. They confidently presented basic metallurgical mathematics, proving that under such extreme, localized pressure, the heated hydrogen would literally eat right through the solid steel walls, instantly resulting in an apocalyptic factory explosion that would vaporize everyone inside. Bosch ignored the overwhelming scientific consensus. He marched directly into the BASF executive boardroom and brazenly demanded an astronomical, unprecedented budget. He was essentially asking the sprawling corporate empire to recklessly bet its entire century of accumulated wealth on a mathematical impossibility that could easily bankrupt them. The board meetings were brutal, screaming matches of epic proportions. The financial risk was utterly staggering. If the experimental reactors inevitably exploded, BASF would be completely annihilated. Yet, the tantalizing lure of seizing absolute control over the world's food supply eventually overpowered their deep corporate terror. The monumental construction of the testing facility immediately commenced. It looked less like a chemical laboratory and far more like a terrifying, heavily armored military installation. Bosch demanded the thickest steel ever forged by human hands. Terrified of the incomprehensible forces he was about to actively unleash. When the massive compressors roared to life for the very first time, the solid earth violently shook. The pressure inside the thick iron chambers rapidly climbed to horrifying extremes. The mechanics stood far back behind thick blast walls, sweating profusely, heavily anticipating a catastrophic, immediate failure. Within mere hours, the critics were proven absolutely right. The superheated hydrogen silently dissolved the solid carbon steel from the inside out, turning the unbreakable metal into brittle glass. Without warning, the massive high-pressure reactors violently exploded, completely obliterating the million-dollar machinery in seconds. Failure after catastrophic failure followed. BASF cash reserves aggressively bled out into the toxic soil. Every single time Bosch built a thicker, stronger, and more expensive steel reactor, the relentless hydrogen atoms effortlessly devoured the internal structure and explosively shredded the immense casing to useless scrap. They were essentially fighting a brutal war against the invisible laws of basic chemistry. The phenomenon of hydrogen embrittlement seemed utterly unconquerable. The corporate board demanded an immediate halt to the financially ruinous project, but Bosch stubbornly refused to accept defeat, locking himself inside his laboratory. Then, in a moment of sheer mechanical genius, Bosch realized you could never permanently trap the high-pressure hydrogen. So, instead of fighting it, he ingeniously designed a revolutionary double-walled reactor. He placed a soft iron inner lining to let the gas harmlessly escape outward. By deliberately drilling tiny release holes in the thick outer steel casing, he completely relieved the internal pressure on the main structural wall. It was incredibly dangerous, counterintuitive, and visually terrifying, but it mathematically solved the ultimate metallurgical bottleneck that had destroyed all previous prototypes. While Bosch silently waged his relentless metallurgical war, the British saltpeter cartels laughed haughtily in their luxurious London offices. They openly dismissed the German chemical efforts as pathetic, expensive child's play. They truly believed their absolute, ironclad grip on the world's agricultural survival was permanently guaranteed. By 1912, deep inside the industrial heart of Germany, the massive Oppau plant began to violently rise from the earth. It was a sprawling, terrifying labyrinth of massive, thick steel pipes, giant roaring coal furnaces, and earth-shaking, multi-story, heavy industrial compressors, relentlessly pumping explosive gas. The financial tension was absolutely unbearable. BASF had completely liquidated almost all its corporate assets to fund this singular, monstrous behemoth. If the new double-walled megareactors failed, the largest chemical conglomerate in the world would cease to exist overnight, utterly bankrupted by scientific arrogance. September 1913, the ignition command was given. Thousands of tons of raw coal were brutally incinerated to spin the massive iron compressors. The ground physically quaked as the internal pressure reached a mind-bending 200 atmospheres. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the blast. The explosion never came. Instead, from the outlet valve, a massive, continuous, violently freezing stream of pure liquid ammonia began to pour into the heavy holding tanks. The impossible machine was alive. It was successfully ripping solid fertilizer straight out of the thin air. The production volumes were utterly terrifying. What took nature millions of years to slowly deposit on isolated islands, Bosch's monstrous steel behemoth replicated in mere hours. Word quickly reached London. The invincible British monopoly on the world's food supply was instantly and permanently broken. BASF quietly transitioned from a simple chemical company to an untouchable global superpower. They dictated the absolute margin structures of global agriculture. They were pulling limitless wealth out of completely thin air. But this newfound scientific power contained a dark, terrifying dual nature. In 1914, just as the agricultural crisis was solved, World War I violently erupted. The British Royal Navy immediately blockaded Germany, cutting off all foreign imports. Under normal historical conditions, the German military would have completely run out of explosive gunpowder within roughly 6 months. But ammonia is the exact foundational precursor to nitric acid, the core ingredient in highly destructive military high explosives. Overnight, the gigantic machine that was built to save humanity from mass starvation was ruthlessly reverse-engineered to manufacture limitless mountains of explosive artillery shells. Because of Haber and Bosch, Germany was completely immune to the British saltpeter blockade. The Oppau plant pumped out millions of tons of synthetic explosives, actively extending the bloodiest war in human history by several agonizing, catastrophic years, resulting in millions of additional casualties. The mechanism that fed the world had seamlessly become the mechanism that destroyed it. BASF held an absolute, impenetrable monopoly on both life and death. The specific technical details of the massive reactors became the single most aggressively guarded industrial corporate secret in the entire world. When the war finally ended, the victorious Allies demanded exactly one thing above all else: the secret blueprints to the Haber-Bosch process. Spies, engineers, and hostile corporate armies descended upon the Oppau facility, desperate to steal the complex metallurgy that could magically spin air into gold. The technology inevitably leaked, triggering an unprecedented era of global chemical automation. Massive, heavily modified replicas of Bosch's pressure reactors began violently erupting across the United States, Russia, and Japan. The era of manual guano mining was brutally and permanently erased from global economic history. Crop yields exploded exponentially worldwide. For the first time in human history, the biological limit on the human population was aggressively shattered. The Malthusian trap was utterly destroyed by brute force engineering. Fields that had been dead for centuries suddenly began producing mountains of endless grain. The corporate entities that controlled this incredibly dangerous extreme pressure technology quickly morphed into the silent, invisible giants of the modern world. They no longer held a temporary monopoly over shipping lanes. They held an absolute, permanent monopoly over the fundamental chemical building blocks of human life. Even today, deep inside heavily guarded, highly automated industrial megacomplexes, Bosch's fundamental engineering design remains essentially unchanged. Thousands of modern chemical plants currently operate continuously day and night, utilizing immense pressure and staggering heat to tear apart the Earth's atmosphere for raw fertilizer. The absolute scale of this modern industrial machinery is simply beyond human comprehension. Annually, these automated megafactories forcefully inject over 150 million tons of synthetic nitrogen directly into the Earth's agricultural soil. It is the single largest biological intervention ever engineered by mankind. The chilling reality of this hidden process goes much deeper than just farming, because all food requires nitrogen, and synthetic nitrogen forms the backbone of global agriculture. Exactly 50% of the nitrogen atoms currently inside your own DNA originated inside a Haber-Bosch reactor. If we were to completely shut down the global network of synthetic ammonia plants today. The Earth's natural soil could only sustainably support roughly 4 billion people. The other 4 billion human beings alive right now exist purely because this extreme, high-pressure machine continuously operates. The historical irony is staggeringly profound. Fritz Haber won a Nobel Prize for miraculously saving the world from absolute starvation. Yet he was utterly demonized for pioneering the brutal chemical weapons used in trench warfare. He died entirely broken, heavily exiled, and deeply controversial. Karl Bosch, the ruthless mastermind who successfully engineered the impossible massive factory, ultimately became the supreme leader of the entire German chemical empire. Yet he helplessly watched his brilliant life's work aggressively weaponized by a fascist regime he deeply despised. It completely destroyed his soul. This is the profound, terrifying paradox of supreme human engineering. The exact same high-pressure mechanism that definitively prevents billions of innocent people from brutally starving to death also enabled the mass slaughter of millions on the grim, muddy battlefields of Europe. Progress is rarely innocent. We do not build golden statues of the massive high-pressure reactors. We do not celebrate the heavy double-walled steel pipes that quietly sustain our fragile existence. The Haber-Bosch process operates entirely out of sight, heavily guarded in remote, heavily industrialized zones, utterly ignored by society. However, this incredibly complex, automated system represents a terrifying modern choke point. To hit the required internal temperatures of 600 degrees, the global nitrogen network forcefully consumes approximately 2% of the entire world's energy supply. It is dangerously tethered to global natural gas availability. If any major geopolitical conflict severely restricts natural gas or heavy coal supplies to these incredibly massive chemical processors, global crop yields would instantly and catastrophically collapse. Within months, we would brutally revert right back to the terrifying starvation metrics of the late 19th century. The epic story of Karl Bosch and Fritz Haber forces us to acknowledge a stark, profound economic truth. We have not outgrown our strict biological limits. We have merely built incredibly dangerous, high-pressure machines that continuously and aggressively hold the grim reaper of starvation at bay. Before this violent chemical intervention, true wealth was fundamentally dictated by how much land a king controlled or how many islands he could militarily conquer. Bosch proved conclusively that true economic supremacy belongs to those who successfully engineer their way completely out of physical scarcity. The next time you look at a simple, mundane piece of bread, quietly remember the staggering financial ruin, the brutal engineering wars, and the terrifying pressurized explosions that were historically required just to force the empty sky to feed you today. Our vast modern civilization is not supported by natural magic or gentle farming. It is brutally sustained, second by second, by heavily armored steel tanks humming in the darkness, tearing apart the very molecules of the atmosphere. The impossible machine never sleeps, and it can never, ever stop.